Hi, everyone. I'm very excited as this is our very first episode at the Startup Sales Podcast. We have a very special guest today, Michael Goldenberg from Boston. Michael is going to tell us what are the three most important indicators to look for when hiring a new sales rep, and also how to onboard them quickly so that they could start selling. As you know, it's not just important to bring in the new clients, but also to keep them. Michael is going to share with us the mechanisms he has put in place at LogMeIn in order to retain customers. And maybe the biggest question of all, should salespeople be worried about AI taking their jobs? It's going to be a great episode, and I hope you learn a lot.
Startup Sales is a podcast about what it's really like to get a business off the ground. We talk with founders, CEOs, and sales VPs from the high-tech market. You'll learn how to build and scale a sales team. You'll also hear about the growth challenges and tough decisions from others who have had both successes and failures. And now, your host of the Startup Sales Podcast, Adam Springer.
Michael, thanks for joining us.
Thank you for having me, Adam. It's my pleasure to join today. Looking forward to the discussion.
So why don't we start with a brief explanation of your current company, Mineral Tree?
Yeah, absolutely. So Mineral Tree focuses on providing AP automation for the middle market, so accounts payable automation for the middle market. And our slogan is, so you can grow AP how it should be. And that's mainly because candidly, accounts payable isn't necessarily the first priority for most businesses, but oftentimes it can hold them back from growing those businesses because it's just manual, tedious parts of the process they don't really like to do. So we help people focus on the things they really care about. And really, when you think about accounts payable and accounting in general at this point, the feeling most people have is that it should be better. It should be less paper-based. It should be easier. And so that's where we help them get to where, in their mind, they know it really should be.
Yeah, I understand. Is this a SaaS platform or is this a on-prem?
Yeah, it's a SaaS-based platform that actually adds to the accounting system they're typically running, whether that be a NetSuite, Intact, Microsoft Dynamics, QuickBooks, and we continue to build out many others.
All right, and you have some things, some different items on your resume before Mineral Tree, but let's start kind of more even earlier at LogMeIn. Can you tell me a little bit about your journey there?
Yeah, absolutely. So, when you look at my particular experience at LogMeIn, I think the thing that kind of sums it up in general, or I like to think of in my own mind, of course, is taking initiative to then have the opportunity to grow. And what I mean by that is, and this is something I try and express to all my reps as they're talking about their own growth, is do the role and then ask for the title. And so throughout my career at LogMeIn, I was trying to figure out ways, whether that was creating a customer experience analyst role. I started to already do some of that work before I actually asked for that position. Before I was a manager and then even into a director role, I was often taking on some of those responsibilities before then asking for those positions, where it was more of an inevitable progression versus give me the title and then I'll prove myself. I always felt as though, and I try and get this across to all my reps, is prove yourself, then ask for the title. And so I was very fortunate to have a lot of great mentors and leaders that I worked with at LogMeIn that allowed me to really take on that additional responsibility, but then also rewarded me for that additional effort and ambition that I was, able to show there.
Great. I think that's one of the biggest things that I also am looking for when I'm looking for sales reps is people that are going to take that initiative and push themselves first and then ask for permission. You talked about that you started to take the initiative in creating your own position at LogMeIn to analyze the at-risk clients. Can you talk more in depth about that and kind of the problems you found when starting to look into this?
Yeah, so when I was doing this at LogMeIn, and this was, I'd have to look back probably 10 years ago now at least. Um, LogMeIn had the benefits of a huge customer base, certainly of some of their consumer-based products and things like that. And they had a huge amount of data and usage information and things like that. But historically, there hadn't been a lot of attention put towards trying to look at that different data and try and really align the patterns to figure out, what were some of the either red flags for someone being at risk, but equally so, what were some of those indicators of potential growth? And what was really interesting, I mean, there was a couple specific use cases we were able to find. For instance, we realized that a huge portion of the support calls that we were getting were really for something very simple. It was essentially a confusion around part of the login process where because people were essentially seeing that they couldn't log in but didn't understand why, we were able to plug, quick holes there to solve those problems. And there were some other, anecdotal stories like that where we were able to, make small tweaks that really moved the needle quickly. And that was exciting. And that was, it was good to see that kind of initial impact that we were able to have. But then also bigger picture, we were able to start to see some trends in terms of, for instance, the difference between if someone early in their process, early in getting set up with the product, if they were to use two of the key features, they were drastically more likely to both add on additional licenses as well as renew. And if they were using three of the key features, and there were kind of five total key features, but if they were using at least two of them, and even better if they were using three, the numbers and the likelihood again of both growth and retention immediately went up. The other thing is, it's interesting now, and again, this is call it 10 years ago. Net Promoter Score was still, relatively early. And customer success was early too. People weren't really doing as much of that, or they certainly didn't really call it customer success at that time. And, I think one of the key insights we had, because we had looked at it as a retention effort in a lot of ways, and it was, how do we prevent people from leaving? But I think the insight we had, and we didn't necessarily tag it as customer success, was that the retention and customer success actually happened at the very beginning. That first 30 days of someone using a product, they're going to establish the majority of their habits of how they use the product. And so you're winning and losing that customer at the beginning, not at the end. And, I'd like to think of it as kind of the analogy of if you wanted people to stay at your party, you shouldn't try and stop them on the way out the door. You should make it a really great party so they never want to leave to begin with. And so that was, I think, a huge key insight for us was, just the importance of the beginning versus historically we had, waited till somewhere between, 60 to 90 days before renewal and then, reached out to them to, just ensure they were okay. And so we kind of flipped it around from there to really focus on the front end.
And are you taking the same kind of principles with you to the newer companies that you've been with, including like Mineral Tree?
Yeah, absolutely. And like I said, I think, the world has changed since then also in the way people look at things. And even if you look into things like behavioral science in general now, people understand that people are not necessarily completely logical. They are more emotional in their decisions. And so it is important to create that image in their mind and to create that impression early on that it is a valuable, good tool that they're using. So I think a lot of companies are doing this more now, but certainly here, I mean, the amount of emphasis we put on implementation and just getting people off the ground and running is tremendous. And we have a huge focus on that in particular, even more so than the retention at the end. That should be a natural step at the end of a year. It shouldn't be a new negotiation.
What kind of tools are you using now to kind of monitor for these kind of things?
So we actually more recently rolled out Churn Zero, which allows us to just have better insight into our usage data, patterns, things like that, able to create different tracks and things like that in terms of different customers and ensure they're being successful throughout the life. In implementation in particular, it's a very hands-on process. Each customer is assigned a product, or I should say a project manager, who walks them through that. And we're using a series of tools, Salesforce, and some add-on functionality there around the project management stuff, as well as even some simple things like Google Docs to track and ensure everyone's working together. And to some extent, the sales rep's job is done when they sign the contract and come on with us. A sales rep is not going to get compensated on a deal we don't get implemented. So that alignment is critical. But I think a big part of it too is, and this is true, I think, in general for customer experience right now, is people get super annoyed by telling one person something, then having to go to the other person and tell them the same story over and over again. It creates a terrible experience. So I think a big part of what we try and do is the simple things, is the blocking and tackling in terms of just ensuring that we properly pass the information from the sales rep to that implementation person. So it's a natural handoff progression. It's not like they feel like they're starting from scratch with a new person. And that's been, the more we've focused on that, we've seen, a great impact in terms of people just getting off to a better start. Implementation appreciates it as well, because it's just less of a scenario of them having to look like an idiot asking really basic questions that, someone already spent a bunch of time trying to really emphasize. So I think those are some of the key things we try and focus on here.
Is that kind of like a manual process, the handover? Or is there like a form that you kind of fill out and pass it along to the onboarding?
Yeah, so we actually, there's a whole process that takes place in terms of when they close the deal. Is one, it kicks off an email to the implementation team with all the details. Then there is a warm introduction email that the account executive is sending to the end client, that both copies the end client and the implementation specialist. And it lays out a couple clear first steps that they need to take, as well as providing a more detailed overview of the entire process. We deal with accountants primarily who we're selling into, so they are detail oriented. So they really want to see every little step that's going to take place in the process to give them that comfort as they move forward.
Let's take a sidestep here.
Sure.
When you're onboarding new sales executives to your team, what kind of process do you have?
Yeah, so it's a pretty in-depth process in terms of, it includes a combination of some really in-depth learning, in terms of learning about the culture, the product, the process, our different sales methodologies, things like that, and kind of more classroom type training to start with. Then from there, we roll into them doing more shadowing and things like that, to initially get off the ground. It depends. So obviously for our business development role, it's a little bit faster in terms of what they need to know to get off the ground and up to speed. And for our account executives, it is, significantly more in depth because they do their own demos and things like that. So we spend a lot more time really doing in-depth product training for those people. That being said, we also really try and promote from within culture. So a lot of times our account executives are BDRs who have been promoted. And so they really understand a lot of the fundamentals of what we do and how it works. It's really a matter of getting them up to speed on sales process. But in general, it's we've got it's probably up to about 150 page sales playbook that they're expected to go into in great detail. And just a personal philosophy and strategy that we try and employ is kind of a go away and learn and come back and talk kind of approach. So, oftentimes, sometimes based on time restrictions, things like that, I don't want to sit there and have to lecture each individual person as they come on. What I like to do is give them break it into buckets of certain resources and things for them to study and to learn. And then we come back and review them and answer questions. So there's not a bunch of time me reading them things that they can read on their own. It's much more conversational around which parts make sense, which parts don't, and providing additional clarity. And it seems to be a really effective use of everyone's time.
Do you do a lot of role playing?
Absolutely. Yeah, you've got to. I can only talk to someone about how to swing a bat so much. At a certain point, they got to just start taking some swings. And ideally, they're not swings in an actual game to start. They're on the practice field first. But yeah, role playing is huge, and it's funny. I like to somewhat bust people's chops and somewhat play the devil's advocate. Sometimes be a little bit tough on them. But the funny thing is, by the time they start to actually get on the phones and talking to people, they realize that I wasn't actually being that tough, and that that's actually just the reality of sales.
Yeah. So do you give them a lot of leeway once they're hit the phone, or how long of a leash are you giving?
So it's a combination. I mean, I think we've got a really good environment in terms of the other team members typically helping out a lot. So I do lean on my team as well to help. If anyone hears something that someone's saying that isn't correct, they should be making that correction for someone. It's a very open, collaborative environment in that respect. And, it's important for, especially when you're new, to be very open to that feedback, things like that. But we're listening to recorded calls, things like that. So it's something where we're trying to correct on the fly as we go, but also, we'll take time. So we do role plays, but then, because the training never stops, and we do weekly one-on-ones. And often in those one-on-ones, we'll review some of the different calls and, which ones went well, which ones didn't. Sometimes I'll let them pick. Sometimes I'll pick just to make sure there's no funny ones out there. But, it's a balance in terms of, I'm a strong believer in you can't expect people to do things that you don't make extremely clear for them. So we do give a lot of coaching and guidance and help in terms of the pitch and all those things and what to say. But alternatively, when you think about motivating people, nobody wants to be a robot reading a script. Certainly, I don't think in this day and age, certainly not with, some of the younger generations. So I really do like to encourage their own autonomy to try and test things. And it's very much a meritocracy environment where, I always say, whatever works is what we do. I don't care if it comes from me. I don't care if it comes from the guy scrubbing the toilets. If it works, we will do it. And so I do try and encourage that autonomy. And sometimes the best ideas come from the newer people who, haven't been as jaded or had as many experiences. And, they just try something that no one else had tried before. So it's a balance of that guidance, but also, giving people enough autonomy that they feel like they can put their own spin on it, their own creativity. I think as much as anything, you try and teach people not what to do, but why to do it. And then they can make their own judgments from there much better than if you're just giving them orders to follow, because then as soon as they have to go off script, they won't really understand how to make those decisions.
I think that's a very important part, is having them understand why something is a particular way, so that they understand it, not just, as you said before, you don't want a robot.
Yep, absolutely. Although those are coming too, but that's a whole other topic for another day.
Yeah. Well, I just saw the release of Google's new voice, and it could order a place at a restaurant for you and actually speak to a human.
Yeah, and again, not to go too off topic, but I think for every salesperson today, you need to really look deep inside yourself and think, this is coming. This is AI bots. It is coming. Where are you going to add value? What are you going to still be able to bring to the table? Because the reality is, the bot might be better at making sure it asks all the right questions every single time. Where are you really going to be able to add the value? And I think even without that competition coming in, it still remains the case today, which is, where I think salespeople still add the most value is, providing context and being able to, put things into a way and frame things in a way and be able to read a person in a certain way that they're able to really address the things that matter the most to them versus kind of just, again, reading off a script. But
yeah, matter the most to the prospect, not to the salesperson.
Exactly.
All right. So back on topic, what are some of the early signs that you found when a person's not going to work out for the company?
It's interesting. It's always hard. You can interview, you can check references, you can do back channel references, you can do many things to try and, you can do different psychological tests. There's a lot of resources and ways to ensure that you're going to get the people that you hope to get. But obviously that is not always the case. I think it's one of those things. This goes to my philosophy in general when it comes to both hiring, firing, promoting. Ultimately, what I'm looking for is progression. Are the people, early on, you tend to see either people are kind of picking it up and they're getting it, and they keep adding to their arsenal of tools, and you explain something and they absorb it and they turn around and they do it differently. And even the most junior person you hire, as long as they're continuing to make the adjustments, they probably have more adjustments to make, but as long as they continue to make the adjustments, they're going to be okay, and they'll be heading in the right direction, and they're progressing and they're continuously getting better. Where you start to get alarmed and concerned and is when, very early on, often you're able to see that, you're having to review the same things, week in and week out, and the adjustments aren't exactly being made, and there's no real good reason why they're not being made. It's I got to really remember to do that kind of thing. So that's kind of the biggest indicator to me is like, are we talking about the same things multiple times? Or is it, we kind of knock down one and move on to the next thing? So I'd say that's kind of one of the big indicators for me personally. But, the other thing is this, and this is kind of on the softer side of things, which is, there's some element, and this is a little less tangible, but, how much does it seem like the person cares? That's a big part of it also, right? I mean, you see, there's just some people, they come in and you can tell from early on, they're, for whatever reason, as much as you try and avoid it, in hiring, it seems like, they're content to kind of slide into the middle, versus someone who comes in and you can tell they're just trying to push even from day one to be number one. That's another kind of, red flag. You see someone come in and get complacent very quickly. Those are ones that definitely make me nervous.
I understand very much. So I think the first part of what you were saying is coachability. I think that's the biggest thing for you, is that they're coachable.
Yeah, and I don't remember where I stole this from, some book, but it really resonated with me, which is, trying to find people that are hungry, humble, and smart. That hunger thing, unfortunately, is the hardest to find. Everyone in the interview says they're going to be the hardest working person, but needless to say, they're not all. That's, absolutely critical. Everything else you can almost figure out, but that you can't teach that. And it's so hard to find, humble, them being open and coachable and not getting defensive, things like that. That's a big part of it. But, part is what I was saying, and I don't know, maybe I'm wrong in calling it being smart, but is the people who are able to self-identify issues, or able to look into, internally and say, here are the things, or identify, be self-aware enough to identify the things that they are doing to be able to fix them. That's a big part of it as well. Someone who's not just going to wait around for me to tell them, hey, that's not working, but for them to be able to come to me and say, hey, I feel like this part isn't working. Can you help me with that? That's a huge piece of it. Maybe that's a little bit coachability. To me, it's a little bit of self-awareness and intelligence.
Yeah. How do you find that in an interview?
Oh boy. You know what? It's funny. I've tried
The
every
$1 million question.
I've read every article there is about, hiring questions and things like that. I try and ask for more specific examples of anything that someone says. So an example, right? Everyone will say, "I'm going to be the hardest working guy. Just hire me. I'll be staying. I'll come in earlier and leave later than everyone." So I just try and have them focus on specific examples of things. And it's funny how quickly, when you ask someone, give me a real world example of where you've, actually recently been the hardest working person, or give me a scenario in which that was actually the case. And it's like, well, I mean, in general, and they can't really come up with it. So as much as anything, I try and, do those types of things. I have all sorts of kind of not trick questions, but, you ask one question, which is seemingly asking for one answer, but you're really asking it to determine something else. As an example, one of the big things we're always talk about here is accountability. And so, when I'm trying to get to things like accountability, I don't ask them, "Hey, are you accountable? Give me an example of where you've been accountable." I like to ask the question of, give me a scenario in which you've failed and tell me why you think that happened. And all I'm really looking to see is, are they going to blame something else? Because, in sales, there's always going to be some excuse, some reason why we weren't able to get the thing done.
It's always the lead. The leads are bad.
Yeah, exactly. It's a shitty customer. But, that's, so are they going to blame something else, or are they going to turn it on themselves and really be able to say, yeah, maybe I didn't get the best coaching or training, but, it's my fault. I should have taken more of my own time to do this. I learned, and ideally even they turn it around and explain how, they, from that learned lesson, they actually applied it to something else down the road. So those are just a couple ways I try and get to that type of stuff.
Okay. So what are some of the challenges in growing your sales team?
Boy, there's plenty of them. It's funny. I often feel like being a sales leader is, half motivator, half psychologist. And you tend to have a lot of strong personalities on any given team, especially in sales, especially for, dominant personalities who all like to win. So trying to balance, I think, those personalities is probably the hardest part, just in terms of getting everyone pointing in one direction, working together. I think that can be the toughest part. And it's interesting. That's something, one of the things we've tried to focus on to increase that collaboration and really get everyone pointing in the right direction. Because the reality is this, right? Individually, people can do well and do fine, and that's great. And to some extent in sales, it's like, as long as you're making your money, you're not overly concerned with how other people are doing. It's not necessarily your problem. But that being said, when you think about the greater purpose of, when someone's at a company of trying to really build something and build something great, you can't do that alone. So you really do need to have, that team environment. You do need to have a team all helping each other. Bill Belichick's an amazing football coach, but a huge part of the success for the Patriots has been that on-field leadership, and that, collaboration of those teams. So, in order to try and build out more of that, I think a big part of it is really just trying to get people to know each other a little bit better. I always kind of relate the story, and I apologize because I don't remember the guy's name, but long story short is this gentleman, an African-American gentleman, whose kind of whole mission is to get KKK members to, leave the organization. And he starts by asking, why do you hate me? You don't even know me. And then often that kind of spurs the conversation of a bunch of, misunderstandings or stereotypes that aren't necessarily true, that, these people bring up. But the point being that, and this guy's had, amazing success in terms of, actually getting people to leave the KKK. But the way he's able to do it is they just get to know him. And so it's something simple in terms of people taking the time to get to know one another. But, I think that's, been something we found to be extremely helpful in terms of getting everyone really on the same team, even when to some extent you've got people competing. And even in some cases, you have some competing interests a little bit. Getting everyone pointing in the right direction, in the same direction. That's something that is critical because, again, it's not just the individuals that matter, it's the team.
So how are you doing that?
How are we doing that? Combination. So, we have kind of group projects that we're working on. So as an example, we're building out, some new email cadences, a new cadence matrix for the different types of people that we're reaching out to. And so the team's working on that together. It's not just me writing emails. They're kind of working together to write those emails, doing regular biweekly lunch and learns with the team where different team members will present to the rest of the team. That's been a good one. Doing
present on what?
It varies quite a bit, the topics, so we do it every 2 weeks, and sometimes it's, more specifically, for instance, someone's, sales techniques and things like that they've used at previous companies that have worked well. Sometimes they're more product focused if someone's really strong in product. So the topics vary from, week to week. It just has to do with kind of what's top of mind for the team, things that they're interested in. A lot of times, I'll bring it back to teaching some of the different sales methodologies, things like that. Even sometimes, it'll be some sort of trend that people may be hearing, in the market and talking about that and the impacts to us. Like, for instance, conversational marketing / sales, and what is that and what does it mean and how are we trying to use it? ABM, account-based marketing, account-based sales. Again, what does that actually mean? What are other people doing around this? What are we doing to, get the most out of that strategy? So it just varies from week to week in terms of, what's top of mind, what people think will be the most helpful. But that in conjunction with, this team events is a big thing, obviously, whether that's anything outside of the office where people can just get to know each other on a little more personal basis goes a long way. And then one of the things we've started to do more recently is kind of just shorter stand-up meetings towards the end of the day where, people can just kind of get that feedback. Hey, what's one good thing that worked today? What's one thing that didn't? Get a little feedback from everyone, how they might approach it, and that's been really productive as well.
Michael, thanks for joining us today. I think that the biggest thing that I took away from this is to take initiative and prove yourself before taking the position or asking for that responsibility. So prove yourself first. I think that's really important. So thanks for taking the time.
Yeah, my pleasure. And, I would leave you with even beyond that is, one of my favorite, sayings is, change means opportunity. I think for anyone in sales, certainly in sales leadership, you should always be thinking about what are we changing? What are we addressing? What are we doing to move things forward? There's zero complacency. And I think to the point you made earlier about taking initiative, it's just having that hunger, that drive to just never leave things alone.
Absolutely. Okay, great. Thank you, Michael.
All right. It was a pleasure. Thanks a lot, Adam.
Thanks for listening to Startup Sales with Adam Springer. Subscribe to the podcast so you never miss an episode. To contact Adam about consulting services or speaking engagements, visit startupsalespodcast.com or email startupsalespodcast@gmail.com.
Great, Michael. 5 questions to end things off. What is your favorite sales or leadership book?
Favorite sales or leadership book? There's so many good ones. I don't know if this is necessarily sales or leadership, but I'm going to say it anyway, which is a book called Predictably Irrational is one by Dan Ariely that I really love. And part of it is it just talks about human psyche and behavioral science. And I think the biggest misunderstanding people have when they go into sales is they're going to be dealing with a bunch of logical people making logical decisions. And the reality is it's anything but that. And the sooner you're able to figure out what actually drives people's decisions versus what they say is going to drive their decision, the better off you'll be.
I think that's a direct answer to the question. It is both sales and leadership, even not being titled it.
Absolutely.
Yeah. Do you have someone that you follow for sales or leadership ideas?
Boy, there's a lot of them. I'm a big Daniel Pink guy, big Dan Ariely guy. Really like the Heath brothers. Michael Lewis is a great writer who just recently wrote a book, The Undoing Project, which is amazing. And then, candidly, I look up to some of my mentors that I've worked with in the past as well.
Okay. A whole list.
Exactly.
Yeah. Are you available 24/7 or do you have strict personal time boundaries?
Don't tell anyone I said this, but the reality is, if there's a deal to be had, if there's something important, I'm available 24/7, but don't go publishing that.
Okay, I'll call you at 3 a.m.
Listen, if you're in sales, there's no time off. If there's an opportunity to make money, move the needle, then, you got to be ready at all hours for that.
Absolutely. What is your favorite tool used for sales?
Oh, that's a tough one. I would say right now, the number one tool that I've been kind of using the most and taking the most advantage of is probably SalesLoft in terms of our email and, phone cadence and follow-ups, things like that. And part of the reason I like it so much is it actually ties in and integrates with so many of the other solutions that we're using and giving just more insights on who to email and when and pulling that all into one view is super helpful in a way that, for however long I've been thinking, like, I don't understand why Salesforce doesn't just do this, but, that's something that in general, not only that, but it works. And I should knock on wood before I say that, but, I've used some solutions in the past where the integration wasn't great, or, you had kind of a lot of just technical hiccups. It's been a really strong product to really increase our activity and our productivity. And also, one of the things I really try and focus on is try and minimize the amount of mental energy a rep needs on any given moment to think of, like, who do I go to next? Who do I call next? Who do I reach out to next? And this does a great job of just, bringing that next person up and for them.
Excellent. That's great. What one piece of advice do you have for all the founders, CEOs, and sales leadership out there?
Boy, that's different for each. But I think what I would say is it's important to understand where you're at in the business life cycle to set your expectations correctly, to set what you expect out of people and results correctly. And what I mean by that is you need to have very different expectations for when you're in that product market fit piece versus when you're in trying to get a repeatable sales process in funnel versus, when you're scaling the business. And I think the mistake people often make is they think they're in the scaling part way too early and don't realize that you need a different type of, for instance, when you're in that product market fit, you need a different type of rep, you need a different type of approach, you need a different type of flexibility. You're going to see a different kind of result. You can't ask, for instance, when you're in that product market fit, are these conversion rates, in line with the industry? Because the reality is, if it's brand new, there probably are going to be lower. The key is just to try and standardize or have a common definitions that you can use to then gauge your growth and just ensure that you're making progress. But I think, like all things in life, one of my favorite sayings is expectations are the building blocks of disappointment. So if you have the right expectations at those different phases and understand the right goals, I think it just leaves everyone in a better place versus unrealistic expectations and then, expecting the world when you're very early on, and then, being disappointed, and then you churn through a bunch of people for no good reason, because you're not looking for the right things in terms of where they should be and what they should be accomplishing at that point.
Absolutely. Great. Michael, thanks again for coming, and pleasure having you on.
Yeah, it was my pleasure. I really enjoyed the conversation.